Welcome to Champion Stories. If this is your first time here, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And now, on to today's story. The morning sun cast long shadows across Burnham Park in Baguio City as Manny Pacquiao adjusted his baseball cap and pulled it lower over his eyes. It was barely 6 in the morning, and the mountain air carried that crisp coolness that reminded him why he loved coming to this city whenever his schedule allowed. Today was supposed to be a simple jog through the park before his training session, a moment of peace away from the cameras and the constant attention that followed him everywhere. As he rounded the corner near the old bandstand, his footsteps slowed. Something about the figure hunched on the wooden bench ahead made him pause. The man was clearly asleep, his worn jacket pulled tight around his shoulders despite the growing warmth of the day. His graying hair was disheveled, and his shoes were scuffed beyond recognition. But there was something familiar about the profile, something that tugged at a memory buried deep in Manny's mind. Manny approached cautiously, not wanting to startle the sleeping man. As he drew closer, his heart began to race with recognition. The face, weathered by time and hardship, belonged to someone he had once watched on television screens across the Philippines. This was Teodoro Santos, a man who had once graced the silver screen in countless Filipino films during the golden age of cinema in the 1980s and 1990s. The champion boxer remembered staying up late as a young boy in General Santos City, watching Teodoro's action movies on their old black and white television. His mother, Dionysia, would often shoo him to bed, but Manny would sneak back to catch glimpses of his childhood hero performing incredible stunts and delivering lines that would become legendary in Filipino cinema. Teodoro had been more than just an actor. He had been a symbol of Filipino pride and resilience during a time when the country needed heroes. Now seeing this once celebrated figure sleeping rough on a park bench, Manny felt a profound sadness wash over him. The contrast was jarring. This man who had once commanded respect and admiration, who had filled movie theaters across the archipelago, was now reduced to seeking shelter wherever he could find it. His clothes, though clean, were clearly worn thin from use, and the small plastic bag beside him seemed to contain all his worldly possessions. Manny sat down quietly on the opposite end of the bench, careful not to wake Teodoro. He pulled out his phone and cancelled his morning training session, something he rarely did. Instead, he found himself studying the sleeping man's face, noting how the years had carved deep lines around his eyes and mouth. Those were the same eyes that had once blazed with intensity on screen, bringing characters to life that had inspired an entire generation of Filipinos. The park around them was beginning to come alive with early morning joggers and elderly people practicing Tai Chi. A few vendors were setting up their small stalls, preparing for another day of selling fresh flowers and local delicacies. The familiar sounds of Filipino life continued around them, but Manny remained focused on the man beside him, wrestling with memories and emotions he hadn't expected to encounter on this peaceful morning. As he sat there, Manny couldn't help but reflect on the unpredictable nature of life and fame. Here was living proof that success could be as fleeting as morning mist, and that even those who had once stood at the pinnacle of their profession could find themselves forgotten and struggling. The sight stirred something deep within him, a combination of respect for the man's past achievements and concern for his current circumstances. 20 minutes passed in comfortable silence as Manny remained on the bench, watching the steady rise and fall of Teodoro's chest. The morning joggers continued their routines, some recognizing the boxing legend, but respectfully maintaining their distance when they noticed his contemplative mood. A light breeze rustled through the pine trees that lined the park, carrying with it the scent of fresh mountain air mixed with the aroma of street food from nearby vendors. Gradually, Teodoro began to stir. His eyelids fluttered open slowly, revealing eyes that, despite their weariness, still held traces of the charisma that had once captivated audiences across the Philippines. For a moment, he seemed disoriented, blinking against the morning light filtering through the tree branches above. When his gaze finally settled on Manny sitting beside him, confusion clouded his features. The recognition was mutual, but unspoken. Teodoro's eyes widened slightly as he processed who was sharing his makeshift bedroom. He sat up straighter, instinctively running his hands through his disheveled hair in an attempt to make himself more presentable. The gesture was both touching and heartbreaking, revealing that despite his circumstances, his pride and dignity remained intact. Manny offered a gentle smile, the kind that had endeared him to millions of fans worldwide. There was no judgment in his expression, only genuine warmth and respect. He had learned long ago that true character was revealed not in moments of triumph, but in how people handled adversity. The man sitting beside him had clearly faced more than his fair share of challenges, yet there was still something noble about his bearing. Teodoro's hands trembled slightly as he gathered his few belongings, clearly preparing to leave. The plastic bag contained what appeared to be a few changes of clothes, some personal items, and a worn manila envelope that he clutched protectively. His movements were deliberate but slow, suggesting that sleeping on hard benches had taken its toll on his aging body. The former actor glanced around the park, perhaps checking to see if anyone was watching this unexpected encounter. His face showed a mixture of embarrassment and resignation, emotions that Manny understood all too well. Having grown up in poverty himself, the champion knew the weight of having others witness your lowest moments. He remembered the shame he had felt as a child when classmates would see his family's simple living conditions. Without saying a word, Manny remained seated, his presence both comforting and non-threatening. He understood that sometimes the greatest gift you could give someone was simply acknowledgement of their dignity. His own journey from poverty to global stardom had taught him that everyone deserved respect, regardless of their current circumstances. As Teodoro prepared to stand, Manny noticed something that made his heart ache. Pinned to the inside of the man's jacket was a small, faded newspaper clipping. Though he couldn't read it from his position, Manny suspected it was a review or article from Teodoro's glory days in cinema. The fact that he still carried this memento spoke volumes about the man's character and the dreams he refused to completely abandon. The morning sun climbed higher, casting new patterns of light and shadow across the park. More people began to fill the walking paths, but the bench where these two Filipino icons sat seemed to exist in its own private bubble. The weight of unspoken understanding hung between them, heavy with shared knowledge of both struggle and achievement. Manny found himself reflecting on his own mortality and legacy. Here was a man who had once been celebrated, whose name had been known in every household across the country. Yet time and circumstance had reduced him to this moment. It was a sobering reminder that fame and fortune, no matter how great, could not guarantee security or happiness in the twilight years of life. Teodoro finally stood up from the bench, his movements careful and measured. The years had clearly taken their toll on what had once been an athletic frame, but there was still a certain grace in the way he carried himself. As he adjusted his jacket and gathered his belongings, Manny noticed the man's hands bore the calluses and scars of someone who had worked hard manual labor in recent years. These were no longer the soft hands of a pampered actor, but the weathered palms of a man who had done whatever it took to survive. The former actor paused for a moment, his eyes meeting Manny's with a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. In that brief exchange, volumes were communicated without a single word being spoken. Teodoro's expression conveyed his appreciation for the boxer's respectful presence, while also acknowledging the awkwardness of their current situation. For a man who had once commanded attention through his performances, being discovered in such vulnerable circumstances must have been particularly difficult. Manny remained seated, giving Teodoro the space and dignity he needed. The champion understood instinctively that rushing to offer help might wound the man's pride further. Instead, he watched as Teodoro took a few steps away from the bench, then stopped and turned back. Something in his posture suggested he wanted to say something, but the words seemed caught between pride and necessity. The morning light revealed more details about Teodoro's current situation. His shoes, though polished as best as possible, had holes worn through the soles. His jacket, while clean, showed signs of careful mending where the fabric had torn. Despite his obvious poverty, there was an unmistakable effort to maintain his appearance and dignity. This attention to personal grooming, even in his circumstances, spoke to the man's character and his refusal to completely surrender to despair. Manny found his mind drifting to his own childhood memories of watching Teodoro's films. He remembered one particular movie, where the actor played a poor fisherman who never gave up hope despite facing incredible hardships. The irony of that fictional role compared to the man's current reality was not lost on the boxer. Life had a way of blurring the lines between the stories people told on screen and the ones they lived in reality. As Teodoro stood there, clearly wrestling with some internal decision, Manny noticed other park visitors beginning to take notice of the unusual scene. A few elderly women practicing their morning exercises had slowed their movements, their curious glances shifting between the famous boxer and the disheveled man beside him. Some younger joggers had also begun to whisper among themselves, though they maintained a respectful distance. The weight of public attention seemed to make Teodoro more uncomfortable. He clutched his plastic bag tighter and took another step away from the bench. His body language suggested he was preparing to disappear into the city, to blend back into the anonymity that had become his protection. For someone who had once thrived under the spotlight, the current scrutiny must have felt like a cruel reversal of fortune. Manny stood up slowly, his movement deliberate and non-threatening. He brushed off his jogging shorts and adjusted his cap, all while keeping his attention focused on Teodoro. The champion's own celebrity status meant he understood the complex relationship between public recognition and private dignity. He knew that sometimes the kindest thing one famous person could do for another was to normalize their interaction, to treat them as an equal rather than an object of pity. The manila envelope that Teodoro had been protecting so carefully slipped slightly from his grip, revealing what appeared to be old photographs. Manny caught a glimpse of what looked like publicity stills from the actor's heyday, images that captured him in his prime, confident and vibrant. The contrast between those photographs and the man standing before him now was stark and deeply moving. A gentle breeze swept through the park, rustling the leaves overhead and carrying with it the sounds of the city waking up. Traffic was beginning to increase on the nearby roads, and the vendors were calling out their morning offerings to potential customers. Life was moving forward all around them, yet this moment between two Filipino icons seemed suspended in time. Manny took a step closer to Teodoro, closing the distance between them with the same measured confidence he displayed in the boxing ring. His approach was neither rushed nor hesitant, but rather carried the quiet assurance of someone who had learned to read people and situations with precision. The champion's presence seemed to have a calming effect on the former actor, whose initial impulse to flee appeared to be wavering. The photographs that had partially spilled from the manila envelope caught the morning light, revealing glimpses of a younger Teodoro in various movie roles. One image showed him in the uniform of a police officer, another captured him mid-action sequence, and a third revealed him in formal wear at what appeared to be a film premiere. Each photograph represented a different chapter of a career that had once been the envy of aspiring actors throughout the Philippines. Teodoro's grip on the envelope tightened as he noticed Manny's gaze lingering on the scattered memories. There was something both protective and apologetic in the way he gathered the photographs, as if he felt the need to justify carrying these remnants of his former glory. The careful way he handled each image suggested they were among his most precious possessions, perhaps the only tangible proof that his successful career had not been merely a dream. Around them, the park continued its morning rhythm. An elderly man named Gregorio was feeding pigeons near the fountain, his weathered hands scattering breadcrumbs with practiced efficiency. A young mother named Luz Viminda pushed her toddler on the nearby swings, her attention momentarily drawn to the unusual scene unfolding near the bench. Despite the growing awareness of the two celebrities in their midst, the park's other visitors maintained a respectful distance, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something private and significant. Manny found himself studying Teodoro's face more closely, noting the lines that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. The actor's eyes, while tired, still held flashes of the intelligence and charisma that had made him a star. There was a depth there that suggested a man who had experienced the full spectrum of human emotion, both on screen and in real life. The champion recognized something familiar in that gaze, the look of someone who had climbed mountains only to find themselves in valleys they never expected to traverse. The manila envelope, now securely closed, seemed to represent more than just a collection of old photographs. It was a portable museum of achievement, a reminder of times when Teodoro's name had appeared on movie posters across the country. The fact that he still carried these mementos suggested a man who had not completely surrendered to despair, who still held on to some thread of hope that his story was not yet finished. Manny's own experiences with fame and its complexities gave him unique insight into what Teodoro might be feeling. The boxing champion had witnessed firsthand how quickly public adoration could shift, how success could be as fragile as it was intoxicating. He had seen other athletes and celebrities struggle with the transition from prominence to obscurity, and he understood the particular pain of being remembered primarily for what you used to be rather than who you currently were. The morning sun had climbed higher, creating new patterns of light and shadow across the park grounds. The temperature was beginning to rise, and Teodoro pulled his jacket closer despite the increasing warmth. This gesture seemed more about comfort and security than actual temperature regulation, as if the worn garment provided some psychological protection against the vulnerability of his situation. A small group of teenage students passed by on their way to school, their animated chatter about weekend plans and upcoming exams providing a soundtrack of youth and possibility. Their energy and optimism created a stark contrast to the complex emotions playing out between the two men near the bench. For Teodoro, their presence might have served as a reminder of dreams yet to be realized, while for Manny, it could have represented the continuing cycle of hope and ambition that defined human experience. Manny reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, but instead of making a call, he simply held it for a moment, seeming to wrestle with a decision. The device represented his connection to a world of managers, trainers, media obligations, and the countless demands that came with his status as a global icon. Yet in this moment, surrounded by the simple beauty of Burnham Park and faced with Teodoro's quiet dignity, all of that seemed distant and unimportant. The boxer's thumb hovered over his contacts list, but he didn't scroll through it. Instead, he slipped the phone back into his pocket and focused entirely on the man before him. This gesture did not go unnoticed by Teodoro, whose expression softened slightly at the realization that Manny had chosen to remain present rather than retreat into the digital world that consumed so much of modern life. A memory surfaced in Manny's mind of a particular evening from his childhood. He had been perhaps 10 years old, sitting on the concrete floor of their small home in General Santos City, watching one of Teodoro's films on their neighbor's television through an open window. His mother Dionysia had been working late at the market, and his father Rosalio was away seeking employment. The young Manny had pressed his face against the window screen, completely absorbed in the story unfolding before him. In that long-ago film, Teodoro had played a boxer who refused to give up despite facing overwhelming odds. The character had reminded young Manny of his own dreams, his secret ambitions to become a fighter who could lift his family out of poverty. Watching Teodoro's portrayal of determination and resilience had planted seeds in the boy's imagination that would eventually grow into his own legendary career. Now, looking at the real man behind those inspiring performances, Manny felt a profound connection to that pivotal moment in his childhood. The irony was not lost on him that the actor who had unknowingly influenced his path to greatness was now the one in need of support and encouragement. Life had a way of creating these circular moments, where the inspired became the one capable of inspiring others in return. Teodoro shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his body language revealing the internal struggle between pride and pragmatism. The manila envelope remained clutched against his chest like a shield, protecting not just the photographs within, but the memories and identity they represented. Despite his current circumstances, there was still an unmistakable aura of professionalism about him, a remnant of the discipline and dedication that had made him successful in his prime. The park around them had grown busier as the morning progressed. Office workers were beginning to cut through on their way to nearby buildings, their hurried pace contrasting sharply with the thoughtful stillness that surrounded Manny and Teodoro. Her vendor named Celestino had set up his flower cart near the entrance, arranging sampaguita and roses in neat bunches that would soon be purchased by people looking to brighten their day or express their affection. Manny noticed that several passers-by had begun taking discreet photographs with their phones, though they maintained a respectful distance. The boxer's fame made privacy a luxury, but he had learned to live with the constant attention. For Teodoro, however, this renewed scrutiny might have felt overwhelming after years of anonymity. The former actor's slight hunch suggested he was trying to make himself smaller, less noticeable, despite being in the company of one of the most recognizable figures in the Philippines. The morning breeze carried the scent of pine needles and fresh mountain air, mixing with the aroma of kakanin from a nearby food stall. These familiar smells of Filipino life seemed to ground both men in the reality of their shared heritage and culture. Regardless of their different current circumstances, they were both products of the same soil, shaped by the same values of family, respect, and perseverance that defined their homeland. Without warning, Manny began to walk slowly toward the center of the park, pausing after a few steps to look back at Teodoro with an expression that was both inviting and understanding. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable, an invitation to accompany him, offered without pressure or expectation. It was the kind of quiet leadership that had made Manny beloved, not just for his athletic achievements, but for his genuine humanity. Teodoro hesitated for only a moment before following, his worn shoes making soft sounds against the concrete pathway. The decision seemed to require significant effort, as if years of isolation had made even simple social interactions feel foreign and challenging. Yet something about Manny's respectful approach appeared to dissolve some of the barriers that life had built around the former actor's heart. As they walked together, Manny maintained a pace that accommodated Teodoro's slower gait. The boxer's natural athleticism was evident even in this leisurely stroll, but he seemed completely unaware of adjusting his speed, making the accommodation appear effortless and natural. This small act of consideration spoke volumes about his character and his understanding of dignity in all its forms. The path they followed wound past a small playground where children were beginning to arrive for their morning play. Their laughter and excited chatter created a soundtrack of pure joy that seemed to lighten the atmosphere around the two men. A little girl named Mayumi waved enthusiastically from the top of a slide, apparently recognizing Manny despite his casual attire and lowered cap. Her innocent delight at seeing a famous person was uncomplicated by any awareness of the complex dynamics at play between the two adults. Teodoro watched the children with something approaching wistfulness in his eyes. Perhaps he was remembering a time when life had been simpler, when success had seemed guaranteed and the future had stretched ahead filled with infinite possibilities. Or maybe he was thinking about the children who had once watched his movies, who had cheered for his characters and believed in the heroes he portrayed on screen. They approached a small pavilion where an elderly woman named Socorro was practicing Tai Chi, her movements flowing like water despite her advanced age. Her concentration was complete, and she seemed unaware of the celebrity presence nearby. Watching her graceful routine, both men appeared to find something meditative and calming in her deliberate motions. The sight of someone embracing life with such dedication and serenity, regardless of age or circumstance, provided a powerful example of resilience. Manny paused near a memorial plaque dedicated to local heroes, his eyes scanning the names of people who had served their community with distinction. The bronze marker had weathered over the years, but the words remained clearly visible, a permanent reminder of the importance of service and sacrifice. For both men, the memorial seemed to trigger reflections on legacy and the different ways that people could make lasting contributions to society. The morning sun had reached its full strength now, casting sharp shadows and highlighting the vibrant green of the park's carefully maintained landscaping. Gardeners were beginning their daily routines, tending to flower beds and pruning bushes with the kind of patient attention that Manny had always admired. Their work was humble but essential, creating beauty and order in a space that served the entire community. A group of tourists had gathered near the park's famous landmarks, taking photographs and consulting guidebooks written in various languages. Their excitement and wonder at experiencing this piece of Filipino culture provided a backdrop of appreciation that seemed to honor both the place and the people who called it home. In their enthusiasm, there was a reminder that beauty and significance could be found in the most ordinary moments and locations. As they continued their quiet walk, Manny guided them toward a small cafe nestled among the trees at the park's edge. The establishment was simple and unpretentious, the kind of place where locals gathered for morning coffee and pandesal before starting their day. The aroma of freshly brewed Barako coffee drifted through the air, mixing with the scent of warm bread that reminded both men of countless mornings throughout their lives. Teodoro's steps slowed as he realized their destination, his body language revealing a complex mixture of gratitude and apprehension. The prospect of entering a public space where he might be further recognized clearly caused him anxiety, yet there was also something in his expression that suggested he was touched by Manny's thoughtful gesture. The former actor's pride warred with his obvious hunger, creating an internal struggle that played out across his weathered features. Manny seemed to sense this hesitation and made a small detour toward a cluster of stone benches positioned under a large balete tree. The ancient tree provided natural shade and a sense of privacy, its sprawling canopy creating an intimate space away from the main foot traffic. Several other park visitors had chosen similar spots for their morning meditation or quiet conversation, making their presence less conspicuous. The boxer settled onto one of the benches and gestured to the space beside him with the same casual grace he might use when inviting a long-time friend to join him. There was nothing forced or theatrical about the invitation, just a simple human gesture of companionship. His demeanor suggested that he had all the time in the world, despite the fact that his normal schedule was typically packed with training sessions, meetings, and obligations. Teodoro finally sat down, placing his plastic bag carefully at his feet and keeping the manila envelope balanced on his lap. His posture remained somewhat guarded, but there was a visible relaxation in his shoulders that hadn't been present earlier. The tree's shade provided relief from the growing heat of the day, and the gentle rustling of leaves overhead created a soothing soundtrack for their continued silence. From their vantage point, they could observe the full spectrum of park life unfolding around them. A group of elderly men were engaged in an animated game of chess at a nearby table, their concentration complete despite the distractions around them. Students from a local university were spread across the grass, some studying from textbooks, while others practiced presentations for upcoming classes. The diversity of ages and activities created a rich tapestry of human experience that both men seemed to find comforting. Manny pulled out his wallet, not to check its contents, but to retrieve a worn photograph tucked behind his credit cards. The image showed a much younger version of himself, standing with his trainer after his first professional victory, both of them grinning with the uninhibited joy that comes from achieving a long-sought goal. He held the photograph loosely in his hands, not showing it to Teodoro but clearly drawing some personal strength from the memory it represented. This gesture seemed to resonate with Teodoro, who unconsciously tightened his grip on his own collection of memories. The parallel between their situations was not lost on either man. Both carried physical reminders of their past achievements, tangible proof of times when they had stood at the pinnacle of their respective fields. The difference was that Manny's career was still active and celebrated, while Teodoro's had become a collection of fading images and distant applause. A maintenance worker named Elmer passed by with his cart, collecting scattered newspapers and empty water bottles with the methodical efficiency of someone who took pride in his work. His presence served as a reminder that dignity could be found in any honest labor, and that every job played a role in maintaining the community's well-being. Manny carefully returned the photograph to his wallet and stood up slowly, his movement deliberate and purposeful. He walked the few steps to where Teodoro sat and, in a gesture that surprised even himself, knelt down beside the bench. The position put him at eye level with the former actor, eliminating any sense of hierarchy or condescension that might have existed between them. It was a posture of respect, one that acknowledged Teodoro's dignity despite his current circumstances. The manila envelope that Teodoro had been protecting so carefully throughout their encounter began to open slightly, revealing more of its contents. Among the expected publicity photos and movie stills, Manny glimpsed something unexpected, a stack of handwritten pages covered in careful, precise script. The writing was dense and thoughtful, with corrections and additions marked in different colored ink, suggesting multiple revisions and careful consideration. Teodoro noticed Manny's gaze and, after a moment of internal debate, carefully extracted one of the pages. The paper was worn from handling, but the words remained clear and powerful. It was a screenplay, written entirely by hand, detailing the story of a young boxer from an impoverished background who fights not just opponents in the ring, but the social and economic barriers that threaten to keep his community trapped in poverty. The revelation was stunning. All this time, Teodoro had not just been carrying memories of his past glory, but had been actively creating something new. The screenplay was clearly a work of passion, informed by his years of experience in the film industry and his more recent intimate knowledge of struggle and hardship. The story was deeply Filipino, filled with authentic details and emotional truth that could only come from someone who had lived both sides of success and failure. As Manny read the visible portions of the script, he recognized elements of his own life story woven throughout the narrative. But this was not a simple biography. It was a universal tale of resilience, family loyalty, and the power of never giving up on one's dreams. Teodoro had transformed his own experiences of loss and redemption into a story that could inspire others facing similar challenges. The former actor's eyes watched Manny's reaction carefully, searching for any sign of judgment or dismissal. Instead, he found genuine interest and respect. The boxing champion understood immediately that this was not the work of a man who had given up, but of someone who was channeling his experiences into something potentially meaningful and valuable. More pages emerged from the envelope, revealing detailed character sketches, scene breakdowns, and even rough storyboards drawn in the margins. This was clearly a professional-level effort, the product of someone who still possessed all the skills and creative vision that had once made him successful in the film industry. The only thing missing was the opportunity to share it with someone who could help bring it to life. The morning sun had reached its peak, flooding the park with golden light that seemed to illuminate not just the physical space around them, but the possibility that this chance encounter might mark the beginning of something unexpected and wonderful. Other park visitors continued their daily routines, unaware that they were witnessing a moment that would change both men's lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. As Teodoro carefully gathered his pages and returned them to their protective envelope, there was a new energy in his movements. The shame and resignation that had marked his earlier demeanor had been replaced by something resembling hope. Manny rose from his kneeling position and extended his hand toward the former actor, not in charity or pity, but in recognition of a fellow creative professional whose story was far from finished. Thank you for watching another episode of Champion Stories. If you enjoyed today's story, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming inspiring tales about Manny Pacquiao. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and many times your ideas inspire our next episode. See you next time.